What did you guys think about that podcast? What did it do well?
There were a lot of different voices to keep things interesting.
A lot of different voices. I mean, we've already heard one from Gastropod already this semester. We're going to listen to about 4, I think, from that series throughout the semester. So yeah, it's a lot of different texture to the podcast. What do you think, Christian?
This might sound like, well, that's kind of the point, but I learned a lot of facts about taste I had never even heard of or even thought about in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never heard of like the idea of a super taster, or sort of the more primordial reasons why humans had taste. I guess it had been there in the back of my head. I just never really thought about it. So I really enjoyed listening to just sort of get that sort of information.
It's pretty informative.
Yeah.
And
Any?
the scene with the big group of people when they were counting their taste buds, you could hear all these people reacting. It was very memorable. I knew exactly what they were doing. I could really picture it, and it was a good way to like keep me interested.
So listening to the actual people taste it, and it kind of gave you an empathic sort of into it. You were able to empathize with them. Yeah.
There were a lot of different. They talked about a lot of different things. They had like a lot of different examples. It wasn't like they were just kind of going on and on and on about one thing. Like they talked about it, they kind of give it its due time, but then it was just like they move on to something else.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't really get like bored hearing the same thing over and over.
Someone over here had their. Yep. Yeah. What could they have done better? Is there anything when you were listening to it, you're like, I'm lost here, or they're losing me, or I'm getting bored, I'm falling asleep, I don't understand what they're talking about. They hit some trigger, or I don't know. Was there anything like that, or do you think it was really exceptionally well done? Okay.
The ads.
Huh?
The ads were catered towards women.
It's an interesting observation. Yeah. Yeah, it's giving you, the ads were giving you insight into who they think their listening audience is, right? I mean, they were like for bras or something like that, brasiers. Yeah, that's an important observation. Whenever you're making something like that, when you're writing, when you're making a podcast, when you're making a video or a movie, when you're giving a talk, a lecture, any way that you're communicating, to be an effective communicator, you have to think about who you're communicating to. What's going to keep them interested, or what's going to actually enable you to get your point across to them so they're going to understand it and remember it and take it with them and feel like you were making a valid point, or it was worth their while to spend some time listening to you. So that's an important thing to consider when you're putting your own together. How do you feel about the electric spoon? Who would use an electric spoon? Is anybody curious even? A little? Would anybody try it? I would try it at least.
Can we get one for the class?
Sure, I can try. It just depends. Maybe we can make it. Have to see what the specs are. Just hook a little 9-volt battery up to it or something. I don't know. We'll see what we can do. Yeah, I'm interested. It was kind of, I was curious about it. Okay, well, there are, for this week, has anybody listened to any this week for this Friday yet? I don't know when you listened, but I have amended it a little bit. So you must have listened to the main calling one. Okay, there's actually 3 on there. So there was the one about Fritz Haber, which is obviously very interesting, and we'll get to Fritz Haber later in the week. And then there's a main calling one about food sovereignty, which I thought was appropriate because we're going to Common Ground this weekend, and that's the last of the podcasts in the series. And I added a third in there. I wasn't able to figure out how to embed it. The This American Life website wasn't working for that, but there's a link where you can click to stream it. I'm the least concerned that you actually listen to that one because the part of it that relates to this class is only about 5 or 10 minutes in a much longer. It's like a 30-minute podcast, but it's very interesting story. The whole thing is an interesting story, but about 5 or 10 minutes of it relates to phosphorus, and which is something we're going to talk about this week. So you can listen to that. I put that in as an afterthought because it's really such an interesting story. But give those a listen, putting the priority on the nitrogen one and the main calling. All right. So let's see here. I'm not sure if this is going to work. Here he is, Carl Sagan. I'm going to start with a movie. I'm not sure. It may just... I wanted the audio. Not here.
The lives and deaths of the stars seem impossibly remote from human experience, and yet we're related in the most intimate way to their life cycles. The very matter that makes us up was generated long ago and far away in red giant stars. A blade of grass, as Walt Whitman said, is the journey work of the stars. The formation of the solar system may have been triggered by a nearby supernova explosion. After the sun turned on, its ultraviolet light poured into our atmosphere, its warmth generated lightning, and these energy sources sparked the origin of life. Plants harvest sunlight, converting solar into chemical energy. We and the other animals are parasites on the plants, so we are, all of us, solar-powered. The evolution of life is driven by mutations. They're caused partly by natural radioactivity and cosmic rays, but they are both generated in the spectacular deaths of massive stars thousands of light years distant. Think of the sun's heat on your upturned face on a cloudless summer's day. From 150 million kilometers away, we recognize its power. What would we feel on its seething, self-luminous surface, or immersed in its heart of nuclear fire? And yet, the sun is an ordinary, even a mediocre star. Our ancestors worshipped the sun, and they were far from foolish. It makes good sense to revere the sun and the stars, because we are their children.
All right.
We have witnessed...
That didn't work especially well, the time lag and the audio. I apologize for that. But does anybody even know who Carl Sagan is? No? A few of you. Yeah, I guess he was my generation's Neil deGrasse Tyson or whatever. He was sort of, maybe even a little bit older than me. He was pretty crusty even when I was a kid. But yeah, he was a popular scientist. And, okay, would you hit the B on that? Just the number, the letter B.
Oh.
Okay. Bring this back up. Yeah, you're in the way. All right, there we go. So, as Carl had just told us, we're all made up of atoms that were at one point in time in the center of a star. Can you guys guess what elements we're made up of? And more importantly, which ones are crucial and which ones are major components of our body and which ones are minor components?
Carbon. Iron.
Okay, so green will be major and blue will be trace elements. So I heard carbon. Is carbon major or minor?
Major.
All right. So carbon was the first one. I'm going to put that right there. That was the first one you said. What else? Hydrogen. Is that a trace element or a major component?
Major.
Okay. What else?
Iron.
I heard iron. Is iron major or minor? Just say if it's major or minor. You think? Okay. We'll do that in blue. We'll put 3 there. What else? Okay, oxygen. I heard oxygen. Would you say major or minor?
Major.
What else? Nitrogen, major or minor?
Major.
Okay, so who says major? Who says minor? We'll do that in both. That's kind of interesting. That was roughly half. All right, what else? Calcium, great. Okay. Is that a major component or a minor component?
Sorry.
It's okay. All right, we're gonna circle that in both too because I had heard both. What else?
Sodium.
Sodium, is that major or minor?
Minor.
Minor. Anyone disagree? Okay. What else?
Magnesium.
Magnesium. Okay. All right. So is that major or minor?
Minor.
Minor. Okay. Trace element. Phosphorus. Good. And is phosphorus major or minor? Okay.
Potassium.
Potassium. Major or minor?
Minor.
All right. What else? Anything else in there? We've got hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. Yeah.
Zinc.
Zinc. Okay. Good.
I was like,
Yeah. Right. You guys are probably. Is that a major or minor component?
I would say minor.
Okay. Anything else? Is this everything that makes up humans? Snails.
Fluorine.
Probably some fluorine. Why do you say fluorine?
I feel like I don't know. I feel like there's some fluorine in that.
Okay.
Because there's fluorine in our toothpaste.
Fluoride, at least. Ionized fluorine. Fluorine. Anion. Yeah. Okay. So fluoride. I'll put minor on there. What else? Anything else? Is that all of us? So let me read the ones we haven't done. Helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, neon, aluminum, silicon, sulfur, chlorine, argon, scandium, titanium, a bunch of bigger things, chromium, manganese, cobalt, nickel, copper, gallium, germanium, arsenic, selenium, bromine, krypton, maybe for Superman, rubidium, anything? Oh yeah.
Sulfur.
Okay, sulfur, is that major or minor? Does anyone disagree with that? No? Okay. Anything else? You had a hand up. Chlorine, is that major or minor? Minor, okay. Trace element, you're saying? Anything else? Is that humans in a nutshell? Molybdenum, technetium, ruthenium, rhodium, palladium, silver,
Gold.
gold. You want some gold in us. All right. Is that a major or minor component? Okay. Does anyone disagree with that? Is that okay? You disagree with that? Okay. I'm going to put a question mark there. We have one person who questions that. Anything else? Gold, platinum, mercury, thallium, lead, bismuth, polonium. We're starting to get into some pretty heavy elements.
Don't we have some mercury in us? So I guess that would be minor.
Okay. Mercury is Hg. And
Right
that,
next to gold.
oh, yeah, right. And you want it in. Does anybody disagree with mercury? You all agree with that? I'm not sure you're not.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, you want to see? Let's see. Okay. So, what do we've got? You hit it with hydrogen, a major component.
We almost did.
Yeah, it's over there too. So the color's not so good on the screen. So you missed boron. We have a little bit of boron in this. You said that nitrogen was, some of you said it was a minor component. It's a very common major element in the body. We're going to talk a lot about it. And for those of you who listened to the podcast about Fritz Haber, you would have probably voted blue there, or green. There's a little bit of aluminum and silicon in our bodies. There's a tiny bit of selenium, a little bit of iodine, a little bit of tin. there is copper in us. There's a copper processing disease that results in what are called Kaiser-Flushing rings. They can give you liver disease and change the color of your eyes. Cadmium, cobalt, all of these transition metals, manganese, chromium, vanadium, molybdenum, tiny, tiny trace amounts of these. And you got everything over here pretty well, except that they're all major components of the body. So sodium, for example, is without any sodium, we would not exist at all. It would be sodium chloride is a common component in the blood, and it helps in nerve transmission and muscle contraction and cell and maintaining the electrical gradient across the cell. Some of you did say that calcium was a major component. Unfortunately, there is no gold in our bodies, and mercury is actually quite toxic to humans. Yeah, Sonny, you had a question? Oh, you're just calculating, thinking.
If you swordfish for dinner, there's gonna be mercury in your body.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, mercury is a common. I mean, you don't have to go have swordfish. You can go and have lake trout here in Maine. There are most of the waterways in Maine, at least the benthos, the muck on the bottom is going to have some heavy metal content in it. And the larger, higher in the food chain fish are going to have mercury in it from the paper industry. So yeah, and mercury, you guys are familiar with the story of Alice in Wonderland, right? The Mad Hatter. And that was because hatters often went insane because they would take mercury and use mercury to treat the beaver pelt hats, the pelt that they would make fine hats out of. And mercury was part of that process, and they're like constant contact with mercury. Drove them insane. So, all right. That's all I'm going to use this thing for. Or maybe, why not? I guess I can do both. Just close the top of that. We don't need to have both of them on, I suppose. Or unless you want it. Do you guys want that open? Nah, yeah. So here's the actual breakdown. Most of our body is actually made up of oxygen. 65% of our body is made up of oxygen. The vast majority of that oxygen is tied up in water. A lot of it is tied up in, and this is by mass, a lot of it is tied up in various carbohydrates and proteins in the body, but most of it is water. 18% of our body is made up of carbon, and then only 10% by mass is hydrogen. Nitrogen is only 3% based on mass, although it's an important 3%. It's involved. We'll talk about it later, but it's involved in the formation of all amino acids, all nucleic acids, ATP, which is the fundamental unit of energy in our body, and it's in some carbohydrates. You'll find nitrogen in a lot of different contexts in the body. And then all the others represent only about 4% of who and what we are. Those top 4 elements there, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, are about 96% of what we're made up of. Yeah.
Do you have like water that's like all exists in your body that's different from the water that fluctuates through your body? Like let's say like the hydrogen, the oxygen, most of that comes from the H2O.
Yeah, hydrogen is going to be all over the place, though. It's also going to be all over the fats. Any fat in your body is going to have a significant component of hydrogen in it, and carbohydrates are a reasonable source of hydrogen. Proteins will have their fair share. Yeah. Hydrogen's all over the place as well, but most of it's on water. And when talking about the fluid compartments in the body is really the question you're asking. The fluid compartments in the body, there are intracellular fluid compartments where there's water in the cells. There's extracellular fluid compartment, and that is divided up into interstitium, which is the space around the cells. And then there is the vascular system that has the blood and the lymph in the lymphatic system. And then there is exchange between that and the outside via the kidneys.
Where do these numbers fluctuate?
The amount of hydrogen and oxygen, yeah, not that dramatically. Not that dramatically. When you're talking about when you're excreting, when you're urinating, would that go down?
You have like a lot of water one day and like none the next day.
Yeah, the relative range of dehydration in the body that's tolerable, physiologically manageable, it's actually really small. So when you say, "Oh, I'm dehydrated," it's not like you need liters and liters and liters of water to regain proper hydration. It's the like percentage tolerance that your body has for dehydration is actually a small percentage of the total volume in your body. All right, so we're going to start out walking our way around the periodic table, and we're just going to talk about each of these elements, the trace ones first, actually, and then we'll move on across the periodic table. This guy comes up quite a bit. Carl Wilhelm Scheele. He was Pomeranian, which is a tiny little portion of Sweden on the other side of the North Sea there. And he lived in the 18th century. This guy was extremely prolific in terms of identifying various elements and also biological chemicals. So he is responsible for first identifying citric acid or vitamin C, one of the forms of vitamin C, oxalic acid, which is another organic acid that is part of the citric acid cycle. It's in various leafy greens. Tartaric acid, you guys should be a little bit familiar with from last lab. That was the sour taste element in those different samples we had. Uric acid, found in urine sometimes. Lactic acid, a molecular byproduct of cellular respiration. All these other more simple acids on the bottom. But in addition, he also identified all of these elements here. Hydrogen, barium, tungsten, molybdenum, oxygen, and chlorine. So oxygen's a complicated story. There were at least two others who. He also identified nitrogen. I didn't put that in there. There was at least two others that identified nitrogen. I'm going to talk about somebody else with that. Joseph Priestley is probably the more important name with oxygen. But he certainly was the first to identify hydrogen as being an element. I have a little haiku here. Hydrogen, your single proton. Fundamental, essential. Water, life, star fuel. So Carl Scheele. Next, the next person I want to talk about is Humphrey Davy. This guy was really interesting. He was from Cornwall in England, which is a county in England in the far southeast. And he was responsible for a number of things that are pertinent to this class. One of the things he did was he published really the first book of true food science, the first sort of textbook of food science. It's this Elements of Agricultural Chemistry. It was basically a book that was composed of lectures that he had put together and delivered. You see a picture of that on the right-hand side. And in fact, amazingly, I was able to get a copy of the book from Bowdoin. I have an actual copy of the book out of the special collections from Bowdoin, and somehow they are cool with me having the copy for a year. So here it is. I'll pass this around the class. Please, yeah, take a look at that book. So there's a little piece of history for you. He was kind of interesting. Besides doing very careful studies in food science, he first identified what he called phlogisticated nitrous air, which is what we now know as nitrous oxide. Does anyone know what nitrous oxide is? Laughing gas. He discovered laughing gas. Did he discover it? No, he didn't discover it. He popularized the use. Huh?
Do they also use it in like fast cars?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they use it to enrich fuel in some sort of high performance cars. But the thing about nitrous oxide is, has anyone had nitrous oxide before? Okay, so you can. Was that? Yeah, when you got your wisdom teeth out, what was that like?
Loopy.
You made you loopy. Yeah, loopy. Well, turns out this guy became addicted to it, and at least behaviorally addicted to it, and built this thing here to start with. This is a little like face mask that goes over your face there, over your mouth. He'd hold it up. Yeah. And he got many of his contemporary scientists at the time, Joseph Priestley, we'll talk about him when we get to oxygen, they were all addicted to laughing gas. They don't talk about that often. In fact, to the renown of this discovery spread so far and wide that perhaps you've heard of William Wordsworth or Samuel Taylor Coleridge from some of your English classes. These guys traveled down to Cornwall to hang out in the compound with Humphrey Davy so that they could get regular administrations of his phlogisticated nitrous air. Who says scientists aren't fun? All right. So
Can we get some nitrous oxide for the class?
yeah, I'll see if we can fit that in the schedule. I don't think so. So here are some pictures out of that book that I'm passing around that you can look at yourself. He traveled fairly widely, and there were many different depictions of his travels, looking at different agricultural products across England. So unfortunately, during one of his experiments in 1811, he identified nitrogen trichloride, which is this compound in the upper right-hand corner. In 1811, he basically blew his hand up with nitrogen trichloride and couldn't draw. So he hired this guy, Michael Faraday. Has anybody heard of Michael Faraday before? Yeah. Anyways, Faraday ended up being probably an even more famous scientist in his own right. Hired this guy to be his assistant, his personal assistant. Michael Faraday is the person who eventually discovered electromagnetism. He first identified the principle that we call electromagnetism. That is, you put, for example, you would put a current through a wire, a conducting wire, wrap it around a ferromagnetic material like a piece of iron, and you can induce a magnetic field in that iron. He was the first person to identify that, which is totally revolutionized. It was a technology that revolutionized the world we live in. but it first came from this guy. Faraday is probably the person that actually drew those photos in that book I'm handing around there, although he's not credited as such. I can't imagine how Humphrey Davy got these drawings made when the book was made and published, at least in 1813, and his hand was wasted in 1811. So I don't know. That's a little bit. Maybe the answer is known to that. He did some very careful drawings with the aid of a hand lens of the structure of various plants and agricultural products. He looked at seeds. Here's a lily and the seeds that are associated with them. All right. So why am I talking about this guy? Well, he isolated sodium. And the way he isolated sodium was by passing a strong electrical current through molten sodium hydroxide. So sodium hydroxide, you may know it as like Drano is sodium hydroxide. It's a drain opener. He would heat it up and put a strong current through it. Here you can see on the left-hand side, you can see the reaction of the hydrated sodium hydroxide exposed to a strong current. Metallic sodium would then aggregate on the anode, and the molten NaOH would release gas. So the oxygen gas and water vapor. To do this, he required the largest battery in the world, and this is really what got Michael Faraday's brain cooking about and led him to this discovery of electromagnetism. So this was the first guy to actually identify sodium as an element. He also demonstrated that chlorine gas was an element in 1810. It was originally discovered by our buddy Carl Scheele, about 35 years earlier, but Scheele thought it was a compound. And Davy demonstrated that, in fact, no, it was an element. The name, it comes from the Greek meaning yellowish or light green. All right, so let's put Humphrey Davy on our periodic table. He also discovered potassium, calcium, magnesium, and boron. I'm not going to go through the stories of quite all of those. He doesn't get credit for chlorine, but he did demonstrate that it was an element at least. Sodium, racing to trigger every kiss, every kind act, behind every thought. So that haiku alludes to the fact that sodium is essential to nerve transmission, to the function of all nerves, to the function of all muscles. So, in fact, it is behind every kiss and every kind act, and indeed every thought is fundamentally dependent upon sodium. All right. Whew. Let me catch my breath. Oxygen. All right, so this is the guy who was originally responsible for all the nonsense with the phlogisticated nitrous air. Joseph Priestley was the first person to identify nitrous oxide. But he also identified what he called dephlogisticated air, which we now know as oxygen. This guy was kind of an amateur scientist. In fact, he was a minister that was one of the founders of the Unitarian Church. And he also brought us carbonated water, which seems like a pretty good invention to me. He's the first person to carbonate water. So it's on the board there without looking at it. Can anybody take a stab at phlogiston? Has anybody heard of phlogiston from high school chemistry class? No? Phlogiston was a now very debunked notion of, it was an attempt to come to grips with combustion. And they believed that phlogiston was this, as it says there, fictitious fire-like element that was contained within the combustible bodies and released during combustion. So I'm going to get to it in a bit, but there was, up until this cohort of scientists, the whole notion of elements was dominated by Aristotle. And the four elements were earth, air, fire, and water. We'll go into that into more detail. But as that concept of the physical universe began to break down, there were attempts to prop it up, and one of them was this notion of phlogiston. It's some sort of fire-like element that comes out of something when you burn it. Because when you burn something, you're releasing heat, but you're also seeing smoke that's coming out. And they believe that smoke that was coming out was the phlogiston that enabled something to be burnt. If it had phlogiston in it, it could be burnt. And then when you light it on fire, you're releasing the phlogiston. So he, in fact, identified oxygen. And how did he do it? On the right-hand side here, you see a candle, and it's in a bell jar. If you put, first of all, a mouse in a bell jar, and just let it sit there, eventually it'll keel over and die, right? But if you put it in there with a candle, it'll keel over and die quicker. It dies faster. So the candle is consuming something that the mouse needs to eat, or needs to breathe, pardon me. If you, on the contrary, burn the candle in a bell jar with a plant, and he did mint, very quickly growing plant, and it was a large bell jar. If you grow it in there with a bunch of mint, if you light the candle with a bunch of mint, the candle will burn longer. The candle burns longer. So the plant is doing something that's enabling the candle to burn longer. And if you put the mouse in the jar with the mint and the candle, the mouse lives longer. It still eventually dies, but it will live longer. All right? And this is the process whereby he identified oxygen as being, as what he called dephlogisticated air. All right. So oxygen was actually named by Lavoisier, Anton Lavoisier, who's also a really interesting character. We'll get to him. In 1777, oxygen is a hybrid word that he came up with from the Greek word oxy, meaning acid former, and because at the time, most acids, except the few that were identified by Scheele that didn't fit this mold, but there was the mistaken belief that oxygen is a component of all acids. And Lavoisier was a total skeptic of phlogiston. It was his aim and successful aim to completely debunk the notion of phlogiston. He called it a veritable Proteus that changes its form every instant. And he wanted to, quote, lead chemistry back to a stricter way of thinking and distinguish what is fact and observation from what is system and hypothesis, or in his mind, dogma. And he offered a theory of combustion in which oxygen, discovered by Priestley, played a central role. And this was his experiment that he did here. He would heat mercury. And on the left, he'd heat it in this chamber A, and then he'd watch oxygen go down as you're forming an oxide of mercury. You watch basically not rust, because rust is for iron, but it was an oxide of mercury, and he was able to watch the oxygen level go down and the water rise in the bell jar labeled C on that side. So we'll put Joseph Priestley on there. I'll put a purple around oxygen for Priestley. Oxygen, most of me is you. I strive for independence, yet fail with every breath. We'll leave it there. Oh yeah,
Didn't Lavoisier also, wasn't he the first one to use a calorimeter?
we're gonna. Yep. Yeah, we're gonna talk. Yes, that's right. You're remembering that correctly. We're gonna talk more about Lavoisier too. He was probably the greatest chemist of his generation. Short career. We'll talk about how short next time. Any other questions? I am going to go over to the lab, and I'm going to unlock the lab and leave it unlocked for anybody who feels like their thank you, who feels like their kombucha is potent enough for the second ferment. Then you're welcome to put it in the fridge over there. If you want to keep letting it go, that's fine too. But I'll try to leave that lab unlocked so you can get in for it, because I know one of you had said that. And that's it. I'll make sure to give you guys, the few that aren't going with us on Saturday, I'll give you your tickets. Try to remember them Wednesday or Friday. Maybe I'll give them to you Friday so that you don't lose them. And I'll also have $5 cash, cold hard cash, for everybody, so you can go buy your apples.
Sweet.
All right? Right on. Have a good day.
Thanks, Tom.
Yep.